The title of the project is very forward-looking, Dairy for Future, obviously. It focuses on an important area for milk production along the Atlantic seaboard. The project involves 11 partners led by the Institut d'Élevage in France, with over 20 associated partners drawn from industry. It's funded by the Interreg Atlantic Area Programme, and the project aims to increase the competitiveness, sustainability, and resilience of dairy farming in the region. In terms of delivering value to the sector, its core objective is to identify, evaluate, and then widely disseminate innovative practices across the region. And this is where our pilot farms, really come into their own. And the focus is on four key topics: a strategic analysis of the strengths and weaknesses and particular attributes of dairy farming in the Atlantic area, fostering dairy sector economic resilience, clearly very important, improving resource efficiency, and determining sustainable dairy systems for the future, how the industry might develop and be shaped going forward. And today's event is to share some of those emerging results and conclusions, cross-border with the wider consortium. So we've got 5 presentations from the project team today, together with 2 fairly mind-expanding presentations from keynote speakers, as well as 2 breakout sessions, where you can deliberate in your own chosen facilitated group. So a few points of housekeeping. Harpal, if you move to the next slide, please. So during the event, the audience will be muted, so you don't have to worry about background noise, dogs barking, tractor starting, etc., etc. The platform that we're using enables you to send in questions via the chat function, and we'll endeavor to answer as many as possible through the session. But if there are some left over, the team will no doubt respond subsequently. The live video content will be recorded and published on YouTube and on the Dairy for Future website, which I hope you will have a look at. So the event will have a life after today, being made available a bit more widely and for those who could not be present. Now there is a poll function, which you will hear about more in the breakout sessions. So we have 2 sessions later, and we have the ability to bring the audience onto the stage virtually, so you can take part and contribute to the discussion via that chat function. If at any stage you have got technical issues, then please contact the event organizer on the chat function as well, and they'll help sort it out for you. And we'd also encourage you to visit the expo area via the button on the left-hand menu, where our sponsors, if you like, and have trade stands. Our associates have trade stands and virtual booths. So please, take a few minutes when you're having lunch or during the breaks to pop in and have a look at what's going on there. So moving on then to our first session, we've got 2 presentations followed by a Q&A session. So you can post your questions on the chat on the right hand side, and then we'll pick them up after the 2 speakers have presented. And our first presenter today is Marion Cassagnou, who is an agricultural and dairy market analyst with IDELE in France. So handing the controls over to you, Marianne.
Thank you. So thank you, and hi everyone. So I'm Marion Cassagnou, as Roy said. So I work in the French Livestock Institute, and my job at the moment is to present you some part of the Arc Atlantic area. So take a paper and a pen. You will need it because we are going to do some quiz with several proposals and just one possible answer. So, and we are just focusing on the Arc Atlantic area. So the first question is about tea. So what is the only region where tea is produced between Scotland, Normandy, Basque Country, and the Azores? So I precise, it's where it is produced, not where it is drank. Otherwise, it would have been easier, I suppose. So maybe you have already answered. So it's the SRs. And to present a bit more like the SRs, so the milk production represents around 1/3 of the national milk dairy sector. And it's a very dynamic sector with production increasing thanks to an improvement in the productivity. It's mainly producing liquid milk and cheese with a protected designation of origin and with an average of 34 cows per farm. And it's a very good image linked to the tourism, as you can see on pictures, like it's very beautiful, a very beautiful sun, always for sure. But like the main weakness is the interiority because of the transport cost and the more like geographical isolation. On the right side, you can see the importance of the region and in comparison with the national meat production. So you can see like for Portugal, so I said I saw it's 1/3, and the main part will be in the North Portugal. And if we compared with other region, like for Brittany in France, it's 21%, and it's the first region for France, with around 11,300 farms, with very favorable climate and a dense industrial sector, like around 40 dairy processing plants and 15 different groups. So that's for the main part of it. So second question about water. So where is the rainiest region? So is it Ireland? Is it Basque Country? Is it Galicia? Or is it Britain? Have you already answered? Hope yes. So it's an average for sure. It depends on years, but it's Galicia. And to present Galicia, well, between 2007 and 2017, milk deliveries to the industry have increased by 22%. This increase is thanks to the end of the quota mainly, and the milk production is concentrated in the central and northern part of Galicia. And it's very important for agricultural growth product. And if you look on the right side of the slide, you can see the contrasting trends from 2007 to 2017 with the evolution of milk production. So if you look, there's only 3 regions where it's decreasing. And like, for example, in the North Portugal is a very important region for Portuguese production. As I said, it's more than the half of national dairy production. And the reason of the decrease, it's mainly uncertainty due to the abolition of quota system and reduction of demand and consumption in the national market, which led the industry to reduce purchase and also high production cost. For Aquitaine, like it's a small dairy region for France. For core meat production, it's around 5% of the national level, but it's for dairy sector. It's a region with much more importance for goat milk because it's nearly half of the production of milk goat that is produced in Aquitaine. And for milk production, it's around 22% of national level. And why cow milk production decreased? Mainly because of milk prices in 2020 2009 and 2015 and 16. Prices of meat at the moment discourage farmers, and there was a huge competition with cereal production too. Like as cereal, it's a good production, and mainly it's maybe easier. So there is a competition between both, and it's a good region for corn production, and we could say that there were a competition for corn too, and it's more like today. It's more poultry and duck that took the place and benefit of corn production in the area. So there is a huge restructuring party in that region in France. But if we go in the green part, so Ireland is the country and the region where there is the biggest increase, like nearly 50%. And the growth in Irish milk production has been achieved through a combined increase in national cow numbers and the average milk yield. And fat and protein levels have also improved in Ireland. Well, that's it. And to stay on Galicia, just one more part. It's that in Galicia, if we look more like on a restructuration on the Arc Atlantic sector, like Galicia is lost like 40% of farms, and it's because they are more concentrated. Bigger farm are left, and it's like for sure they left less farms, but on the other side, the concentration of farm could be a good point for all the area for logistical issues, and a high density reduce collection cost. On the other part, like you have Basque Country, and it's kind of the same. It was very small size farm with pluriactivity, and dairy activity is more and more specialized now. So the start of the intensifying in production was mainly due to the quota implementation in 1986. And so now there's less farms, less cows, but much higher yield in the Basque sector. So, question 3. So, what breed is it and why it is? If you find the breed, where you find the region where it comes from. So, is it Cornwall? Is it Northern Ireland? Is it Normandy, or is it Pays de la Loire? Maybe it's an easy question. I don't know. And it's Normandy. For that breed, the Normandy breed is decreasing. It's replaced now by Holstein, but it's still around 1/3 of cows. And for the Normandy presentation, it's a part in France where protein and fat content are higher than the national level, but it's with less yields than the other part of France. And it allows farmers to make cheese, like it's kind of a source of national pride. So you have 4 protected designation of origin: Pont-l'Évêque, Livarot, Camembert, of course, and Neuchâtel. And for that 4 cheese, it's around 550 farms that produce that cheese. And for the butter and cream of Isigny, it's around 600 farms that are inside the PDO. And if you want to compare, in Normandy, there's around 7,800 800 farms around. And it's kind of the second place of the second region in France, and this second place is shared with Pays de la Loire, which is the other one much in the south of Brittany, and it's also a very dynamic region with complementary between crops and livestock, and numerous recent investment in farms and dairy processing. So that might explain the dynamic of this region, and a very differentiated product with good added value and strong brands also in the Pays de la Loire. On the right side, so I think it's kind of interesting if you look where what demand opportunity you have. Like in the north of the Arc Atlantic region, it's more like, for sure there is national park too, but it's also exports world for international exports, and more on the south part, it would be like more to respond to the national demand or local demand. And as we will talk about it later, when you have less consumption in Europe and at national level, well, it could be a threat for south part of the Arc Atlantic. And the fourth question, so on earth size, so among this region, what is the larger earth size? Where is the larger earth size? So is it Ireland? Is it Northern Ireland? Is it Brittany? Or is it Scotland? So among this country, it's Scotland. And if you want to see why, here you have, so on the right side, the average number of dairy cows per farm. So you can see that it's nearly 200 in Scotland. And for Scotland, so around 88% of herds have more than 100 cows. So it's a very high density of farm and mostly few dairy holdings, but very productive, very concentrated in cows. And the production is mainly in the south, like it's concerning around 77% of the production that is concentrated in the south of Scotland. This is it's mainly explained by the weather, because in the northern part of Scotland, weather is not it's too difficult now. Maybe with climate change, it could change also the repartition of dairy farms, but for now it's mainly in the south, and they are producing mainly cheese, like cheddar, and mostly cheddar and liquid milk. And one of some percentage of the surplus of production go to England for processing. And this is shared by the other region. Like in Northern Ireland, it's a grass-based milk production system. And in Wales, it's the fourth highest production by UK origin, and 85% is of farm are more than 100 cows, have more than 100 cows. And in Wales, the production is based on the lowlands, especially in the southwest also, and a system with all year calving. And for all the three, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, Brexit could be an opportunity for that region, because as it kind of close the borders, you have access to England markets. And for Southwest England, it's around 24% of the UK milk production, and it's also a good grass growing potential. It has also a good grass growing potential, and the Brexit could encourage other sectors as lamb, for example, to switch to dairies. So it could be also an opportunities here. But as I said, the question was among the countries, because the main part where with the higher head size is South Portugal. And for South Portugal, it's big specialized farm. There's only around 360 farms, but 35,000 cows. And these cows are housed year-round with very limited number of co-grazing. Here it's the same. It could be explained by weather, because temperature are very high during summers. So you will answer me that with temperature today, kind of most part of south region of Arc Atlantic region are concerned. But if we look at average summer here in the South Portugal are very complicated, because very dry and hot, and drought compromise the self-sustainability of fodder production in that region. All right. So if we summarize on that, so I think the main opportunity for the Arc Atlantic region is agroclimatic condition. In most parts, there is a very good grass opportunity, good grass growth. And as I said, weakness is more for weather in the South Portugal and the north of Scotland. So there's demand opportunities too. There's missing from ore from the national market and for the export, as I said, for the north of the Arc Atlantic area. And a very important concentrated net of farmers and processing sector in all the Arc Atlantic area. But if we are focusing on the agroclimatic condition, while as I said, like for the at the moment, there is a very high temperature in most parts of the Arc Atlantic, and during May it was very dry, and it was very dry also in the Arc Atlantic region. So sorry, I don't have Azores on my map. It was too south. And I think it's the main threats now would be the climate change, because if you don't have any fodder production and grass production in May, like how can you survive in the summer or dry summers and have something to feed your cows during winter? And then you have environmental constraints like greenhouses, nitrogen, all the European programs like Farm to Fork and the other ones. The other threats could be as a generational renewal with age of profile of dairy farmers that are, for some region could be very difficult. For example, in Brittany, in France, it's a real question for renewal of farmers. And then another threat could be the decreasing in milk consumption at national level with more dependency of exports and world markets, so world prices, world demand, maybe more difficult to find more difficult for dairy prices, more volatility of dairy prices and milk prices too. And the rise of cost production, I will just speak about that just after all, and the difficulty to find labor and consumer perception like veganism. So on cost price, I'm not going to speak lots of that, because I'm sure that you're all aware of it, of cost production now, of increase of feed prices, of energy prices. But what I wanted to highlight could be like natural gases price. For sure, it's not improving with war between Ukraine and Russia, but it wasn't the start of the increase is not because of the war. And why is it very important? It's because it's mainly for me because you need gas to dry milk to make powders, and as I said, it's an important product for exports and for lots of region in Arc Atlantic region or depending of exports. And on that part, I suppose Ireland and UK are maybe less impacted by the dependency of Russian gases. So it could be an help or an opportunity during that year instead of, for example, Poland or Germany, which really depend on Russian gas. And maybe could in the second half of the year be have a lack of gas to dry milk. The other point I wanted to highlight is global container prices, because I suppose you know that there is lots of uncertainty on container logistic and on prices for freight. And because of if we are looking more like world things and dairy and with Chinese lockdown, we could have some difficulties then in the second half of the year with Chinese demand. So it's the same, it could impact milk prices at the end. And for feed prices, like you can see on the right side, the volume of concentrate eaten by dairy cows per year, and some of the region are more dependent of it than the other one. So I'm sorry to conclude on a kind of not optimistic things, but it's what we have. It's what it's our concern now, and I think it's more is the main objective of the day today to share innovation and how we can be resilient in the Arc Atlantic area. So there you are, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marion, for that nice presentation and an excellent overview. We'll return during questions. So if the audience would please continue to post their questions on chat, we will pick them up after our next presentation, which is from Lis King. And Lis is a colleague in the Animal Health and Welfare team in AHDB. So handing over to you, Lis.
So to start with then, I'm just going to talk to you about knowledge and innovation systems in dairy farming. So the Dairy for Future project focuses on 4 key issues in dairy farming across the Atlantic area. As you can see, the Atlantic area is shown in blue on the map here. These are the strengths and weaknesses of the dairy sector, developing dairy sector economic resilience, improving resource use efficiency, determining sustainable dairy systems for the future. And if we want to share knowledge and innovations efficiently, we need to have a better understanding of how knowledge and innovation is currently shared. And to do this, we need to take a look at knowledge and innovation systems across the Atlantic area. So my presentation will focus on a summary of the work carried out as part of the Dairy for Future project on agriculture, knowledge and innovation systems, or ACHIAS for short. So what is ACHIAS? ACHIAS stands for Agriculture, Knowledge and Innovation Systems. Simply put, it's the system that provides farmers with relevant knowledge and offers useful networks around agriculture. Of course, in practice, the description is much more complicated than that once we include all the different links and interactions between the different parties. So a more fuller description is given on this slide. It's a set of agricultural organisations and persons, the links and interactions between them, the generation, integration and diffusion and use of knowledge and innovation working towards problem sharing. Working together to support decision making and problem solving in agriculture. So traditionally, agricultural knowledge and innovation systems, AKIAS, were built upon a linear research model as shown here. Farmers were seen only as the end users. Universities and research centres would carry out the research and provide education services. The communication, training and advice was then delivered separately by extension services directly to the farmers. And in the last 10 years or so, AKIAS has developed from this rather academic concept to a broader approach where farmers are not just the end users, but are active players, playing a central role in the generation and exchange of knowledge and innovations. For example, on-farm trials, co-production of schemes, and supporting communication of innovations. As you can see from this slide, the end of this linear approach provides a bit more of a challenge to presenting the AKIAS in a picture form to you. A diverse number of people and organisations are involved in generating, delivering and adopting knowledge and innovation in the agricultural sector in the Atlantic area. The players involved in the previous linear transmission of knowledge to farmers, that's research, education and extension, still have a very important role to play in this broader and more detailed AKIAS structure. However, many other additional players, such as vets, commercial advisors, supply chain, banks, non-governmental organisations, are now considered a relevant part of the AKIAS and in many cases have much stronger impact on the farmer. The farmer is still at the centre of the system as the traditional end user, being the one who will eventually introduce innovation in the farm and utilise the knowledge to improve farming activities. However, farmers are also increasingly involved in the generation of knowledge and innovation, and through various channels such as discussion groups, online forums, social media, and in successful delivery to other farmers. So in this slide, the top right here, you can see that farmers are at the centre, with extension, education and research below in yellow. In blue, input suppliers are to the left, and to the right we have food processors, retailers and consumers. In green, we have communication services, accountants, banks, the press and non-governmental organisations. In the middle diagram here, we can see that farmers are again central and that knowledge and innovation is multi-directional between the different players. And I will come back to this diagram later. So why focus on knowledge and innovation systems? The Dairy for Future project involves 5 countries across the Atlantic area: the UK, Ireland, France, Spain and Portugal. Agricultural and innovation systems differ by these countries, and these differences relate to the differences in farming characteristics of those regions, cultures and traditions, and historical events. Whilst they're diverse and not easily comparable, understanding the AKIAS across these regions allows us to find the best routes for delivery and uptake of knowledge and innovation in the future. So to look then at the methods of what happened within the project. The methods are explained in this slide. Here you can see to the left. Dairy for Future project partners appointed an expert here who collected the information on AKIAS in the regions and about dairy farming, so you've got regional information as well. Where regional or dairy specific data was not available, national and livestock data was used and indicated as such within the report. The aim then of the piece of research was to describe the AKIAS in the Atlantic area in 5 areas, and these are listed on the left-hand side of the screen: development and evolution, structure, function, strengths, and weaknesses. This would identify the most effective ways to develop innovation in the Atlantic area based on the current AKIAS. Importantly, it does not suggest changes to the AKIAS, but rather provides recommendations in where we should focus efforts to make existing systems more effective. So to give a bit of context in the challenge ahead, the next 30 years pose significant pressure on agricultural systems. On the left-hand side here, we can see the world population as a predicted global population growth. So starting in 1990 with 5.3 billion people and increasing to 7.3 billion in 2015, 8.5 billion in 2030, 9.7 billion in 2050, and finally an enormous staggering 11.2 billion in 2100. In the middle here, we can see global life expectancy increasing from 65 years in 1995 to 70 years in 2015, 77 years in 2050, 83 years in 2100. And on the right, we have challenges in global sustainability from the effects of climate change. Feeding a growing population predicted to reach 10 billion by 2050 within the context of climate change is going to be a challenge for food safety and security, and with further instability set to rise from socio-economic pressures following the war in Ukraine. So the evolution of agriculture is always accompanied by innovation, which has historically made it possible to meet increases in demand. On this slide here, we can show some of the innovations seen. So from the primitive digging stick in 9000 BC to oxen-pulled ploughs, water wheels, tractors and machines, and moving towards the 20th century, innovations include the combine harvester, computers and information technology, agrochemicals and monocultures. And in the 21st century, genetically modified organisms, satellites and sensors, mobiles and database software, big data and artificial intelligence leading to precision agriculture. Innovation, as we can see, is key in the evolution of agriculture. So, looking at achaeas and the country differences. As mentioned, achaeas are diverse, making them really difficult to compare. The image on this slide shows the European achaeas plotted according to their strengths, which is defined as involvement of influential actors and resource allocation, and level of integration. So we can see here level of integration along the top and the strength along the left-hand side here. And that's about the level of integration of the actors, which define the level of coordination, collaboration, and competition among them. The Atlantic area countries are circled in red, so you can see Portugal, Spain, United Kingdom, France, and Ireland. As you can see, we have very diverse achaeas in terms of strengths and integration, and the image includes the whole agricultural sector, but the dairy sector achaeas presents very similar characteristics. So just why are they so diverse? The knowledge and innovation systems have evolved differently across the Atlantic area. Each country has been subject to particular historical events which have shaped the development of agriculture. In some countries, the achaeas has always been very integrated, whilst in others it has been characterised by a high degree of fragmentation. Despite these differences, the achaeas throughout the Atlantic area has adapted to the different challenges faced by agriculture and livestock farming. Post-Second World War Europe, agriculture was a key sector, and its objective was to increase the food supply to the population and to secure income for farmers. During this time, the achaeas were structured to provide research and advice, mainly aimed at increasing production. For the majority of these regions, the state played, or the government played, an important role in the coordination of the achaeas, particularly extension services, so knowledge exchange. Modernisation and intensification were important enablers of this strategy of increased productivity. If we move then during the 1990s, the research and advice provision shifted to an agriculture increasingly focused on sustainability, with environment and animal welfare as emerging drivers. Technologies and development in information and communication systems have contributed to a new status quo. And in recent years, there's been a general move of agricultural policies according to the 3 pillars of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social, with increasing importance of the consumer in shaping this approach. So if we go back to our achaeas players, we have the farmer in the middle, as previously stated, and we have other players around the outside. So these include other farmers. So these can be unions, associations, cooperatives, discussion groups, demonstration farms, and WhatsApp groups. General media, so general or specialised, social media, educational institutions, researchers from universities or research centres, dedicated providers, independent consultants, and then private advisors such as commercial or independent vets, nutritionists, and geneticists. We also have other institutions, so charities, non-governmental organisations, and governmental departments. The arrows show the direction of travel of information, so it's not just one way. Information moves from farmers to these other platforms as well. And when we look at this, we can start to see how farming systems, culture, historic events, and policies result in differences in strengths and level of integration between the ACHIAS actors, which define the level of coordination, collaboration, and competition among them. And this has led to the matrix that we saw on the previous slide. So we look at the end user and knowledge and innovation uptake. Many factors can enable or limit the uptake of innovation, and the literature shows us some general trends in terms of age, education, succession, new entrants. Younger individuals and farmers with higher levels of formal education are generally more willing to take risks and are more likely to adopt a new innovation or practice and invest in the business and expand it. Introducing younger individuals with higher education levels represents an important enabler for innovation uptake, providing the innovation is, of course, economically viable. Succession has been identified as an issue by nearly all regions in the Atlantic area. On average, less than half of the farmers have identified a successor. The reason is not known for those who haven't, but suggestions include lack of family or natural successors, or reluctance to take over the family business. Succession plans are very personal to each farm. An important role of the ACHIAS should be able to provide dedicated support to farmers for easier succession planning. It should cover a broad range of aspects, including legal, financial, practical, and psychological advice for both parties. When we look at new entrants, these generally have different profiles to successors. They tend to be younger, operate smaller farms, and are more highly educated, and are more likely to be female as well than is characteristic of mainstream farming. They are more likely to be involved in alternative agricultural systems, so organic farming, short food supply chains, and back to the land movements, and are motivated by the farming lifestyle. New entrants, of course, face several barriers: access to land, high startup costs, low profitability of farming, high bureaucracy, and limited access to information. So specific support is needed to help with legal, financial, practical, and technical aspects of farming. An interesting aspect of the relationship between the farmer and other ACHIAS players is the existence of a ring of confidence, which can be seen in this green circle here. Farmers are again at the centre, and you can see we have an inner ring. Oh, sorry, let me go back. Looking at the inner ring and outer ring, you can see that there are different players within the slides. So I can't see it at the minute, so it's thrown me. And you can see that the level of trust that farmers have in people in the inner circle and outer circle differ, and different players can move between the outer circle and the inner circle. But generally speaking, within the inner circle, you have family members, other farmers, vets and advisors. And then within the outer circle, you have perhaps people that are slightly further afield, so government, people slightly more distant from farming. But of course, individuals can move, and it depends on this relationship between the farmer and the individuals as well, in terms of trust as to how much innovation is taken up and their application to farm. And of course, the closer those ACHIAS players are to the farmer, the more bespoke the advice will be, which means that innovations and knowledge exchange is more likely to happen. As part of the research, the Dairy for Future partners and experts were asked to provide a SWOT analysis. So as part of the research, the Dairy for Future partners and experts were asked to provide a SWOT analysis to look at the strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and some common themes emerged amongst the different regions. So in terms of strengths, farmers are generally focused on the future and open-minded. They're forward-thinking and capable of asking for advice, being interested in innovation and new technologies. Advisors are also numerous, diverse and motivated, providing a wide range of advice. A strength of the French system in particular was strong banking and insurance systems for farmers, which enabled uptake of innovation and technology. In terms of weaknesses, diversity, lack of generational turnover, and fragmented advice have been listed. The high diversity of dairy farmers and farming systems include farmers living in remote areas with poor mobile and internet connections. Fragmented and siloed advice, which can be biased towards specific farm types rather than on efficiency and sustainability, has also been identified. Nearly all regions, even those that were seen as being highly integrated, identified the fragmentation and lack of connection as a weakness, stemming from a lack of effective connection among the AHDB players, who due to diversity may compete rather than collaborate. Opportunities identified were new generations of farmers and advisors who will need in the future a higher rate of education uptake to ensure a capable and adaptive workforce. Also, new knowledge and innovation and evolving requests for consumers were also identified as opportunities. And finally, threats. These included socio-economic changes, including reduction in public funding with less resource and increased competition for money, reduction in quality of knowledge transfer activity of the AHDB, or loss of independent advice, and of course, loss of confidence in AHDB players was also identified as a threat. Would you be able to move on a slide for me, please? So having looked at the development and evolution, structure, function, strength and weaknesses of AHDB across the Atlantic area, what recommendations can be made to increase innovation more efficiently and effectively? So the first one is strengthening links between research and practice. The need for a more collaborative and integrated approach from research has been mentioned by many partners with experts in the Atlantic area. This suggests that more attention is required for knowledge development and transfer, accompanied by a need for expanding interaction and cooperation with research and education centres. Secondly, a stronger collaboration between AHDB players at the local, national and international levels, with shared needs, clearer definitions, missions and directions. Thirdly, greater support to digital transition, supporting farmers through the digital process as they may not have time or a desire to learn modern technologies and use smart devices for business management. One of the key challenges for successful digitalisation is the improvement of mobile and internet connectivity, which is still an issue in many rural areas. And then finally, an increased focus on training. Next slide, please. So continuing with suggestions and recommendations, the AHDB should have a key role in implementation of the Rural Development Programme and Common Agricultural policies. We need to look at prioritising the dissemination of win-win strategies, increasing accessibility to knowledge, for example, with the creation of knowledge hubs, promote cross-region exchanges with farmers, technicians, and where possible involve policymakers, provide bespoke advice rather than generic systems, engage with other users outside the sector to help with solutions to problems and new ideas, so sort of outside box thinking, collaborate with other AHDB players and make use of online tools and learning methods, consider consumer requests as well to increase social acceptance of farming practices. If we go to the next slide then. So in summarising then with the take-home messages, I'd like to leave you with 3 points for positive take-home messages. Firstly, overcoming the challenges of tomorrow provides a win-win for all. Innovations, big or small, contribute to the shared goals from farm to fork and beyond, making sustainability a win-win challenge. Secondly, new generations of farmers, advisors and consumers present an opportunity for innovation due to their differing attitudes, preferences, requests and skills. Their integration is likely to create a more sustainable system from every perspective. Thirdly and finally, increased demand for a more sustainable agriculture also represents an opportunity for innovation as we aim to produce food for an increasing number of people in a sustained manner. So I'd just like to briefly acknowledge all the AHDB experts and advisors involved in the study. A big thank you to the numerous individuals that were involved in the Dairy for Future Knowledge and Innovation System report. The work was carried out before my time on the project, so whilst I've presented their work today, the thanks must go to them. A special thanks to Martina Dorigo, my predecessor on the project, who pulled it all together. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. You did a good job, even if you haven't been involved in the project from the start. So that was a nice presentation of a complex subject. There's a lot of meat in that report, and I'll leave the audience to judge where they might position themselves in that circle of trust or ring of confidence, or whatever your descriptor was. So we have some questions coming through. So if we can bring Marion back on stage as well, please. So we've got quite a few. We may not be able to get through them all. So the first one, Marion, is in relation to the Normand breed, and its use, and a question as to whether the choice of the breed in relation to provenance and PGO status, whether there's a trade-off between the value of provenance and the value of, I guess, biological efficiency. That might be quite a left-wing question for a market analyst, but be interested to hear your thoughts.
Okay, well, I'm not a specialist on that, but with Norman breed, you have less yields, but higher component. So it's very good for cheese when you want to more, or for cream or butter when you want more fat. So it's you have Normand when you could send your milk with higher prices because it will be used for cheese making and butter making with PDO. Otherwise, it's better to have Holstein. So I think the proportion between both breed it depends on what is used for what your milk will be used for. I don't know if it's understandable.
Okay. Thank you.
It's not economically interesting if you are not selling it for cheese making in or butter in PDO.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question, I think, for Liz. In your opinion, is innovation faster during the times when there's more profit available in the industry, or is innovation greater when there's more financial pressure and a greater drive? So what's the greater motivational feature, good times or bad times?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I'm not entirely sure of the answer. I would guess it's under pressure where you've got multiple actors all pushing towards the same common goal, because you're all working towards that common goal. So when there's that pressure there, I think that helps drive innovation. Because you've got multiple players who are all working on potentially the same solution. But I don't know, Ray, feel free to argue with me. Your experience may tell different, but yeah, that's what I would suggest.
I certainly wouldn't argue with you, Liz, on this forum, not least. So we have a number of comments relating to concentrate use and variability, maybe between regions and islands, and perhaps that's something which is difficult to cover in some detail on this kind of conference call. So are northern Spanish and mid-Portuguese herds adopting a block calving system, or is there a requirement for a level profile of milk? Marion, I guess this really relates to the market, doesn't it?
Yes, And I suppose it would be better if Spanish and Portuguese answer to the question in the chat than me. I suppose they are much specialist than me on that question.
Okay, so maybe our Iberian colleagues could post a comment in the chat. And a question from me, really, Marion, is how much of the growth, and there's been some extraordinary growth in those regions, is down to integrated national policies. So you've got industry, you've got the primary producers, the supply chain, all working together towards a common goal, and each bringing their own contribution to the party, if you like.
Well, on that question, I think there is different answer. Like for example, for government part in Ireland, it was a good example. It was the wish of the government to increase milk production, and it really works. So I think sometimes it could help. And then it's more, I think the impact is more on European policy, because as I shared example during the presentation on the quota system, like it really changed the way to do milk in the Arc Atlantic when it was implemented and when it was when it was ended of it. So it's more like, yeah, I suppose it's more European policy than national part in different region. And then now, if we want to go to in the future, like it will be like the European Green Deal and the program Farm to Fork that would have a huge impact on dairy production in we could say in the Arc Atlantic region, but I suppose it will be more like the EU, in the whole EU.
Okay, thank you, Marion. Just to confirm that the symposium is being recorded and will be available to watch back. So that was one question that was posed. So yes, we can reassure you on that. I think there are one or two other questions that we'll actually shoehorn into one of the next sessions. But for now, I'd like to thank Liz and Marion for that presentation. We'll take a short break for virtual coffee or anything else you need just at this point. And if you can please be back in 15 minutes, that would be great. 11:15 in the UK. Thank you. Welcome back to the symposium, everybody. It's 11:15, so we will crack on with the next presentation, and that's from Professor Jude Capper. It's a keynote presentation. We're very pleased to have Jude with us. Jude is a global authority on livestock sustainability issues. She's currently Professor of Sustainable Beef and Sheep Production at Harper Adams University in the UK, and also an independent livestock sustainability consultant. She's got a wide portfolio of activities, I can tell you, memberships and industry awards. And before returning to the UK, Jude spent several years in the US working and disseminating widely on sustainability in dairy production systems. So she's just diversified really to help out other sectors. Jude is also very active on social media under the catchy pseudonym of Bovi Diva. I hope I've pronounced that right, which is aiming to debunk some of the many myths that are out there around livestock production. So over to you, Jude.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you today, and I'm really happy to accept this invitation to speak to you. I have to apologize in advance. I get very passionate about this. I could talk about this for about 3 weeks without even breathing, because I just think it's fascinating and interesting, and something that all of us in the dairy industry, and indeed the wider agricultural industry, really have to think about as we move forward. So I'm going to go as fast as I can while still being understandable, hopefully, because ultimately we really do face a challenge, and I am talking about sustainability overall today, but we often hear about it in the context of environmental sustainability. So we see a lot of press, a lot of publicity, a lot of social media posts, for example, all about greenhouse gas emissions, net zero, carbon footprint. And that is a really clear priority for everybody within the agricultural industry all the way across the globe. But I think what we really have to understand and to bear in mind, and this is the context that I'm going to come into it today, is that sustainability isn't just about the environment. So when I talk about it today, it's a balance of three different factors. So it's environmental responsibility, it's economic viability, and it's social acceptability. And those are all under the auspices of One Health, i.e. that balance between animal health, ecosystem health, and human health. So we've got to balance all of these different factors, and that can obviously give us some really huge challenges depending on our farming system. Now, I am no economist. I know enough to just about be dangerous, but not much more than that. So today I'm really going to concentrate on the environmental aspects and then to some degree on the social aspects as well. So from an environmental point of view, what we do know is no matter what the system is, so whether we're talking about a 2-cow dairy operation in Kenya or a 10,000 cow operation in Texas, what we know is that improving animal productivity should cut the environmental impacts in terms of resource use and greenhouse gas emissions of both meat and milk. So for example, if we're making a set amount of milk or meat, if we improve productivity such that we get improved milk yield, improved meat yield, or improved growth rate, then it should take fewer total livestock and or less total time to produce that set quantity. And what that means is per unit of milk or meat, we need less land, less water, hopefully less fuel. We should have a lower greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint. And therefore that improvement in efficiency and productivity should come at a lower economic cost to the producer, which in an ideal world, of course, would be passed on to the consumer to keep animal source foods affordable. So that's at the very high level. But of course, how we implement that is entirely dependent on system, on region, on breed, on herd size, all of the factors that give us all of these diverse dairy farming operations all over the globe. So if we look at some data that came out from the FAO, this is fairly old now. This came out back in 2010, and it was the FAO report entitled Greenhouse Gas Emissions from the Dairy Sector. And the individual numbers may have changed over the last 12 years or so, but we would still see the same trends now. So what the FAO did was do a life cycle assessment looking at the impacts of dairy production in different regions across the world. So we're going from North America on the left-hand side, Western Europe at the second bar in, out to South America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa on the right-hand side. And you can see the world average on the far right. And what we clearly see from this report is that as milk yield goes down across the globe, the carbon footprint or the greenhouse gas emissions in terms of kilos of carbon per kilo of solids corrected milk goes up. So there's a really clear correlation between cutting productivity in this instance and increasing the carbon footprint. So we know that in any system at a high level, if we improve productivity, if we improve efficiency, then we should see environmental gains. So this was exemplified by a paper that I published back in 2019 now. It was in the Journal of Animal Science, and it was a follow-up to an earlier paper that we did. So in our first paper, we compared the environmental impact of the US dairy industry between 1944 and 2007. And this paper, which was, as I say, the follow-up paper, compared the environmental impacts between 2007 and 2017. And that's only a decade. So frankly, we didn't really expect to see huge changes compared to our previous paper. But it was really interesting to see over this relatively short time period. So as I say, going from 2007, which is the orange bar at the top, compared to 2017, which are the vertical bars going up, you can see that per unit of milk expressed as a percentage, in 2017, the US dairy industry used fewer cattle, less feed, less land, less water, less manure, and had a carbon footprint 19% lower than the carbon footprint back in 2007. So these are really impressive gains. And I should add that these aren't exclusive to the USA. We would expect to see these trends all over the world, although obviously to a higher or a lower degree, dependent on the system, dependent on the region. So we do know that there tends to be this clear correlation between improving productivity, improving efficiency, and resource use and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I should underline that we didn't go into other environmental metrics like, for example, odor or biodiversity. So we're simply looking at resource use and greenhouse gas emissions in this context. But what we also know, and this is from data from the UK, came out from the AHDB, the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, back in 2020 now, is that when we look at dairy performance in the UK, for example, the top 25% of dairy farms in terms of economic performance, again, have improved productivity and efficiency. So they tend to have higher yields, they have higher milk solids, and they have lower cow turnover compared to other systems. So there is this really clear correlation, but we do have some knowledge gaps as well. So for example, at the moment, we don't have good peer-reviewed evidence-based papers out there that compare all of the different factors that improve productivity and efficiency in a dairy operation, because it isn't just about yield. You know, we have to improve everything. We have to do absolutely everything better on any operation. And I think we can all agree that on any dairy farm anywhere in the world, there's always things that could be improved. Some dairy farms are less good, some are okay, some are doing really, really, really well. But on any farm, there's always something that could be done a tiny little bit better. But at the moment, both at the industry level, at the national level, and at the on-farm level, we often don't quite know. Should we concentrate on yield? Should we concentrate on reproduction? Should we improve our heifer growth such that our age at first calving comes down? Do we look at longevity? Should we look at health and welfare, feed efficiency? Should we be looking at improving our outputs into the beef chain through calves? So we have lots of opportunities, and we often don't know exactly how all these link in. And this sounds like a very easy, asinine answer, but the answer is do whatever you can on your operation better. And if we all improve just a little bit every year on year on year, and if we try to meet those key performance indicators for our industry, we can all do better. We can all use fewer resources per unit of milk and have a lower carbon footprint. So this is going to sound as if I'm saying everybody should be intensive, everybody should house their cows, everybody should push for maximum efficiency and maximum productivity. And that's not the case at all. There is no one size fits all. There is no ideal farm. We should all be doing what we can do within the constraints of our individual farms. Because the danger is, when we think about it, globally, there are billions and billions of smallholders who depend on small scale subsistence agriculture for their livelihoods, for cultural reasons, for assets, for all sorts of things. So I would almost argue that the value of a single cow in a 3-cow herd in Kenya, for example, is actually greater for myriad reasons than the value of 1 cow in a 10,000 cow operation, let's say. So we've got to think about the diversity of all of our systems across the world. As I say, there is no one size fits all. It's about what are the most appropriate improvements, management practices, technologies, different feeds, different breeds, different aspects of health and welfare that we can improve on every single farm across the world. So we've got to be more inclusive. We've got to think about the wide diversity of farms that we have all across the world to improve our global dairy industry. And we do have a huge knowledge gap in terms of health and welfare. So this is some really old data now. It came out from OIE back in 2008, and they cited that at the global level, we lose about 20% of our animal protein due to animal disease. And for most of those diseases, we already have treatments or cures, but often they are simply not implemented because of infrastructure, because of political constraints, cultural reasons, lack of electricity, you know, all sorts of reasons. And I've seen some in some sort of anecdotal conversations with animal health associations more recently who think that this number is probably now an underestimate. So if we can have better health, if we can have better welfare, and if we can quantify the impacts of that on environmental, economic and social sustainability, we can move forward really, really, really well. So we have to think about this going forward. But unfortunately, as I say, we don't always have all of the right data. So I'm a complete data nerd. I love data. I love to play with numbers all the time. So I did this fairly simple sort of back of the envelope type calculation a couple of years ago now. And I was looking at the milk, meat and greenhouse gas implications of global dairy cow mortality. And as I say, it's very much a sort of rough calculation. I haven't published it anywhere apart from in conference papers. But if we take the sort of global average cow, and of course there is no global average cow, but let's assume based on the global average milk yield that we have a cow in a relatively developed dairy system giving us an annual milk yield of 4,500 kilos of milk. If that cow dies unexpectedly, as opposed to being a planned cull, it's going to take us about 26 months or so to rear a heifer to replace her. And in that time, given the average calving interval, the average age at first calving, that cow could have given us 8,537 kilos of milk that have now been lost. If we add to that, not just the carcass weight of that cow who, if she hadn't gone into the system, could have been culled for beef, plus the carcass weight of the potential male calves that she could have had over those 26 months, which equals out at about 0.4 calves, we lose 430 kilos of carcass weight beef into the system. And over those 26 months that it takes to rear that replacement heifer, that's going to be equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions of 3,751 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalents. So this isn't just about resources, and it's not even just about animal health and welfare. This is a greenhouse gas issue, this is a milk issue, this is a meat issue, and it's a food security issue as well. So animal health and welfare is more than an ethical and moral issue, but it's also an environmental issue and a food waste and food security issue all across the world. So we urgently need more and better data. And there's recently been some really good data that came out from SRUC in the UK, but this is some data that came out a little bit before that. It was done in conjunction with the Dairy Sustainability Framework, and it came out from Jonathan Statham and colleagues here in the UK. And what they did was to do a pilot study. They were looking at the potential for cutting greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of energy corrected milk through mitigating either different diseases or different syndromes. And they compared Chile, Kenya, and the UK. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to show you the data for Kenya here. But as you can see, if we mitigate diseases either on the average farm or more importantly on the worst 10% of farms, we can have considerable reductions in the carbon footprint of milk. So for example, if we mitigate bovine viral diarrhea on the average farm, it's going to cut the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of milk by about 4%, but in the worst 10% of farms, it would be about 7%. We see roughly similar results for mastitis at 6% with the average and 12% for the worst 10%. But in terms of infertility, it's a huge improvement. So if we have better reproduction on the average Kenyan farm, that could cut the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of milk by 24%, and in the worst 10% of farms by 44%. So we have really huge opportunities, but we do need better data, better disease control, better disease treatment to put this into practice. So as I said, at the moment, this is a balance between environmental, economic, and social, and we've got to think about that social aspect. We know very clearly that if we improve productivity, that we make gains, but we've got to think about the opinions of consumers both now and in the future, because frankly, if my daughter and my nieces who are in this picture on the slide don't want milk, meat and eggs in 5 or 10 or 20 years time, then we're not going to have an industry going forwards. So we've got to think about why people give up milk, meat and eggs. And this is some data that came out from a study published in the UK back in 2019 now. And they asked the question, is the future of food flexitarian? And that's defined as making a conscious decision to eat less meat. And they asked people who are either meat eaters or flexitarians who are thinking of giving up meat, whether they felt guilty when they ate meat and dairy products. Now, in the national population, only 25% of people felt guilty when they ate meat or dairy, which I still think is a really big number. But in the population of those people who are thinking of giving up meat, it was 66%. So 2/3 of people who were thinking of giving up felt guilty about eating meat or dairy. And that gives us a really big challenge, because that guilt factor is a belief, it's a faith. It isn't based on science or numbers or facts. So it's really difficult to overcome. So we've got to work really hard to overcome these challenges. And when they asked further questions about which factors would encourage people to give up meat and to take up either a vegan or a vegetarian diet, not surprisingly, perhaps, they found that animal welfare, healthiness of the milk or meat in terms of human health, and the environmental aspects were the top 3. So those are the factors that we've got to talk about. We need data on. We need to be able to talk to people who are concerned, rightly so, about their dietary choices and say, this is what we're doing for animal welfare. This is why we think it's important to have a healthy diet. This is why the dairy industry is doing everything it can to improve environmental impacts every single day. Because as people, we are unfortunately a little bit like sheep. We are sort of pre-programmed to follow other people and to believe bad news. And from a social science point of view, we know that we need 5 positive stories out there to cancel out every negative. So for every bad clip of poor animal welfare or story about an environmental incident caused by a dairy farm, we need 5 positive stories out there. So we've got to be proactive. We need good information out there every single day. And we often see infographics like this one, which I took from Instagram, which make claims like livestock production uses 75% of the Earth's agricultural land. And it does. That's absolutely true. But most of that land we can't use for anything else. And here in the UK, for example, 60% of our land can't effectively be used for anything but grazing. But that's a difficult thing to explain to the consumer outside agriculture. This was some really nice data. It came out back in 2011 now, so it's fairly old. But what Mike Wilkinson did was to look at all of the components that went into the diets of different livestock, and so to redefine feed efficiency. Because from a traditional measure of feed efficiency, i.e. kilos of feed in versus kilos of milk, meat or eggs out, cattle can look fairly bad. But when we take into account the huge proportion of dairy cattle and grazing beef cattle diets that can't be eaten by people, i.e. forages, grasses, hays, byproducts, we can see that both for grazed dairy and grazed beef, these cattle actually produce more human edible protein in terms of milk and meat than they ever consume. So that's a really important message to communicate to the consumer, who often just sees those total feed efficiency numbers in the media. And not just that, but we've got to move away from simply talking about greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint per kilo or per a glass of drink. So this was a really nice paper. Again, it's fairly old now, but it came out from Smedman et al., who are based in Sweden. And what they did, which at the time was really novel, was to look at carbon footprints of different drinks, but in relation to their nutrient density. In other words, how many nutrients do you get for your sort of carbon buck, as it were? So you can see we've got different drinks here, from whole milk at the top, orange juice, soy and oat juice, red wine, soda, beer, and water. And in this instance, energy was not counted as a nutrient. So that's why beer and soda, for example, have values of 0 for the nutrient density. Not surprisingly, with protein, vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, etc., whole milk scores the best in terms of nutrient density according to the Swedish dietary recommendations. Orange juice is second best, then soy and oat. Red wine does have some nutrients, presumably in terms of the antioxidants that we get in wine. Then we have the carbon footprint by comparison, and you can see that whole milk is sort of intermediate at 99 grams of carbon per 100 grams of drink. Red wine was the highest at 204. Soda and beer were similar to water. Soy and oat much lower at 30 and 21 grams of carbon per 100 grams of drink. So if we just looked at the carbon footprint per unit of mass, we'd think that milk's, okay, red wine's really, really bad, soya and oat juice are really, really good. But the point of a drink, or indeed of any food, is to give us nutrients. So what these authors did was to express the nutrient density against the carbon footprint as an index, with the higher numbers being better. And as you can see, whole milk was almost twice as good as either orange juice or soy drink, and far, far better than the oat drink. And what this could be taken further to look at would be the actual amino acid quantity in the different proteins in these drinks. So it's not enough just to talk about carbon per can of drink or per glass of milk. We've got to look at this further going forwards to help communicate to the consumer, just why it's important to think about not just carbon. Because ultimately, we can have a very low carbon diet based on very low carbon foods. But the lowest carbon foods are honeys, sugars, and syrups. So that's good for carbon. For obesity and health, possibly not. So we've got to look at the bigger picture. And ultimately, as I said, we are all rather like sheep. So we tend to trust famous people who we want to be like. So you've got here a picture of the England rugby player Joe Marler. A few years ago now, he broke his leg just before the Six Nations Championship, but he was back playing in less than 3 weeks, and he put that down to drinking 2 pints of whole milk every single day, and he still does that now, apparently. So we need more famous people to talk about what we do, to cite the benefits of dairy, because we see an awful lot of famous people out there talking about being vegetarian, vegan, flexitarian, but we have to remember that we have our champions as well, and we have to use them better, frankly. So ultimately, it isn't about a one size fits all. It isn't about you should have Jersey cows, or you shouldn't house your cows, or you should always graze them in April. It's whatever fits on your farm. And you've got 2 pictures here. This is on the left-hand side. You have my daughter on her first day playing rugby. She was about 3.5 years old. And in the picture on the right, you have my daughter from last September when she was 7.5 years old as captain of her rugby team on that day. And frankly, she isn't the best player. She's probably the tallest. She's certainly not the best. And I've always said to her, you don't need to score every try. You don't need to be the most perfect. You just need to do your best. And that's the same with all of us. We don't need the biggest herd or the best looking cows or the most perfect pasture. We've all got to do the absolute best that we can do on our operation with our resources, labor, costs, constraints, markets. And if we all do our best to do whatever we can do to improve, we'll have better resource use, lower carbon footprint, better economic costs, and possibly, most importantly, a really good story to tell a consumer and to make them feel good about their dietary choices, including dairy. So with that, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to present to you. You've got my email address here, and if you'd like to ask any further questions in 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months time, and there's a copy of the presentation as a PDF at the link that you've got right there as well. And yes, happy to answer questions if we have time. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Jude, for that very cogent and passionate presentation as ever. I'm sure the rugby analogy went down very well in the Atlantic area, both in terms of Six Nations and La Rochelle, etc., etc. That was spot on. I'm sure you won many friends there. So we do have I think 15 minutes for questions, 10 minutes for questions. So we'll pick up on some that are coming through, and please keep them coming through, because if we don't answer them today, then we will follow up with the answers. Some speed reading here. So the decrease in direct emissions per unit of product is indisputable. However, if the increased production results from the consumption of high levels of feed compounds, so we're talking about imported feeds, soya, maize, etc., is that so obvious? What about indirect emissions? I guess we're talking about land use change there, maybe, Jude, something of that?
Great question. So if we look at the work from the States, for example, cropping, including fertilizers, pesticides, growth of the crops, etc., accounts for about sort of 6 to 12% of the total carbon footprint. So the biggest impact that we do have is from the enteric methane from the cows themselves. Having said that, anything that we can do to increase the use of home produced crops and byproducts is always going to be a huge benefit. So if I could have my sort of ideal dairy farm, it would be with the number of cows that are appropriate to that system. It would be making the best use of pasture land where we can't grow anything else for human food or fiber production. It would be making high use of byproduct feeds. And I actually visited a farm when I was based in the States, and there's a large dairy farm in Oregon, and they were based right next to a fruit and vegetable operation as well. And they were feeding pea silage, they were feeding waste onions, they were feeding all of these different byproducts from human fruit and vegetable production, which was quite amazing. So yes, I agree. We don't want to go to a system where we have an increased milk yield, for example, but it comes at the cost of increased deforestation, monocultures, et cetera, et cetera. We absolutely have to balance that with better byproduct feeds, better homegrown proteins, wherever they come from. And dare I say it, replacing soya in a lot of places where it's not grown in that area.
Thanks. Just going back to a question which was raised in the previous session, but it's relevant to this, Jude. So the question was where there's more local production and PGO type of production, whether that system is more resilient, for the want of a better word, to pressure from veganism, etc., etc. And I guess allied to that, we do see quite regularly fairly big claims made for the move, away, people giving up livestock products, etc. What evidence is there to support that in your estimation?
Really good questions. Dare I say the word COVID here? it's certainly in the UK, COVID was really interesting in how it showed the average person two things. It showed how fragile our food system is in terms of imported food, and we've seen that even more with the conflict in the Ukraine at the moment. So we've clearly seen the importance of local, and particularly from a regional point of view in the UK, all of our sort of small scale farm shops and milk vending machines and things really got a boost during COVID. So there's absolutely a place for those local type systems. And there's a huge consumer boost in confidence from knowing your farm, knowing your farmer, actually being able to talk to the person who looks after the cows, milks the cows, etc. Again, I have a friend based in Norfolk, in the UK. She has a farm shop. She has Jersey cows that are actually kept with their calves. And just from a consumer perception point of view, it's, you know, brilliant. People absolutely love it. And it's really interesting, both in the UK and elsewhere, vegans and vegetarians tend to account for, you know, a small percentage of the population. So in the UK, vegetarians account for about 5%, vegans account for about 1 to 2%. Obviously, this varies widely across the world. But what's interesting to see, both in person, in the traditional media and on social media, is there seems to be a disproportionate amount of noise associated with that. So it seems like the average activist type vegan, and I use that language very carefully because there are an awful lot of very, you know, happy, peaceful vegans who are very happy for anybody to eat whatever they like, but their choice is just not to eat milk, meat and eggs. But when we talk about the sort of activist types who think, you know, meat is murder, milk is cruel, they tend to be very organized, to have very loud voices, to be very, very passionate about that. And so they have a disproportionate voice in the marketplace to the retailer and to the policymaker. And we have to be just as loud, frankly. And that's where we're not always very good. So again, it's in the UK, for example, vegans are a small proportion, but they have a very loud voice. And farmers are also a small proportion, but we have to have just as loud a voice to talk to the consumer.
Thank you. So we have a question here, which is in the same topic, really. It's how can we communicate with consumers, you know, especially as, you know, something that we accept as being fairly standard practice, artificial insemination, you know, can be controversial. And I guess allied to that, in your travels, have you come across particularly effective consumer messaging, and how was that framed?
That's a really good question, because yes, we do an awful lot of things which we think are just completely normal. You know, dehorning, for example. You know, well, it makes sense from the cow's point of view, the calf's point of view, it's safer, it's healthier, you know, etc., etc. To somebody like my mum, who only knows about agriculture because of me, she goes, "Why would you do that? That looks dangerous. That involves needles and drugs and hormones and all of these things." And I think the biggest and the best way to do it, and this is sometimes a bit dangerous, is to share your values. You know, as a dairy farmer, as a person who works in agriculture, I want to do the best I can for animal welfare, for health, for productivity, to lower the carbon footprint. That's why we do Practice X. Now, we always leave ourselves open to, if we improve honesty and transparency, which I believe we have to for everybody, we leave ourselves open to, oh, I didn't actually know you did artificial insemination, sex semen, whatever it might be. And we run the risk, of course, that by being more honest and by being more transparent, the consumer may say, well, I see why it makes sense. You know, bulls can kill people. So many people every year still die from injuries from bulls, for example. It's safer for the staff, safer for the cattle. You can have higher genetic merit, faster progress. but I still don't like the idea of it. And ultimately, we may have to face that, just as we've seen issues with other industries, there may be some things where the consumer goes, I get it from an economic point of view, I get it from a carbon footprint point of view, I still don't like it, and I'm not going to accept it. And if that happens, then we have to be okay with that. But if we share our values and if we put things into context for people in terms that they understand, and I don't mean being patronizing and saying, well, when a baby cow and a mummy cow and a daddy cow, you know, yada, yada, yada. But when we help to explain it in terms of humans, for example, people tend to be more accepting when they can understand the principles, even if they don't agree with why it's being done. And I think it's that fear of the unknown, fear of technology, fear of sort of frankenfood and lab-based and etc. that gets to people. If we explain it in a sensible, well, it's sort of like when people can't get pregnant, we do X, Y, Z. Well, we sort of do the same with cattle, but for this reason and that reason. They go, okay, I get that now. I may not like it, but I understand why you do it. So we've got to bring it down to concepts and technologies and thought processes that people understand outside ag, which can be a huge challenge.
Certainly. Okay, one last question. You're a self-confessed data geek.
Yep.
So we've got a question here. Faced with these communications challenges, etc. You know, how do we generate the data required to evidence the arguments on a national basis rather than say at farm level?
We all need to be better with data. I mean, it's quite amazing. I actually did an AHDB project a couple of years ago looking at medicines use on beef farms in the UK, and the range of ways people recorded their data was astounding. From apps that went straight into the cloud, it's all there, it's really detailed, it's excellent, to, well, I've got a piece of paper somewhere, I think it's in this notebook, might be in here, not sure where that is, think she got treated a couple of weeks ago, not entirely sure. We need better data, we need better recording, we need standardized metrics and ways to record. And anybody who works with any of the dairy management software programs will know there are as many ways for people to put in reasons for culling or treatment as there are dairy farms in the world. So, you know, oh, well, she died, she had this, she had that, it was sort of like this, it might have been like this, not sure what it was, she turned up dead, you know, etc., etc. We need to be more standardized, and we need that data. And I mean, that can be as simple as just having a organized notebook for medicines data or culling data or health data, but we need to record, because it's such a cliche, but if you don't record it, you can't measure it, you can't benchmark it, and we all need to be better at that all across the globe.
Great, thanks. And we have to get over the barrier of sharing data or not sharing data. That's the other psychological barrier. So we've run out of time. That's a great presentation, Jude. Thank you very much for joining us today and participating in the question and answer.